In this hands-on exercise, you will learn how to use the getPivot function. We'll be working in the getPivot before workbook for this lesson. As we discussed in the slide introduction to this lesson, the getPivot function is an alternative to using a lookup formula and uses a pivot table as its foundation. So what I have here is a pivot table, and it is using the same data, that same NBA salaries by team and season start year that we looked at in the pivot table lesson. So if I click on the pivot table, that'll bring up my pivot table fields list, and you can see that I've got season start selected. And before I had that in the column section of the pivot table, I've just moved that to the rows here. So I now have 2010 through 2015 on the rows of my pivot table, and I still have my salary metric in my values section of the pivot table. So what happens if you wanted to do a lookup function here and bring the data from this pivot table into another data table that we'll create over here? Well, first we need to start by creating the actual data table. So let's do a data table, but instead of having the season start years on the row here, we'll have them on the column going vertically here. Okay, so what we can do is just come over here to an open cell. So let's do F8 in this case. I'm going to type in NBA salaries by season start. Okay, let me left justify that, give it a little bit more space there. Now the next thing I'm going to do is come over to my pivot table, and I'm going to highlight all of the season start values. And I'm going to do Control C, our shortcut for copy, come over here to cell G8, and I'm going to use our shortcut for paste special, which if you recall is Alt. I'm going to hit the Alt button, then ES, and I'm going to come down to values, and then I'm going to click this transpose button right here, this transpose checkbox. What that is going to do is it's going to take these values that are now vertical, and it's going to paste them or transpose them into a horizontal order from 2010 to 2015 across the top here of our columns. So I'm going to check that. I'm going to click OK. Okay, it did exactly what we thought. I just want to bold that, and then I want to center it as well. Okay, so all I did there was I brought our values from a row to the header. The next thing I'm going to do is just clean this up a little bit, add some formatting. So I'm going to add the blue to this, and then add white text. Okay, so let's bring in our metric name here. So we'll call this salaries. Okay, so what we've been tasked to do is we need to bring the information from this pivot table across to this data table. Okay, so we have a couple options here. We could do a Vlookup, which is pretty simple to do, so let's do that first. So equals Vlookup. To enter our formula, we're going to hit Tab, and that'll bring us to our lookup tab here. So I'm going to select 2010 or G8 as my lookup value. I'm going to do a comma, and then I'm going to select here and select my data table here, which is the actual pivot table, but I'm selecting the values that I want to show up in my data table based on the season start. So I'm going to hit a comma. I'm going to count my columns for what I want. So I want the salaries, right? So if you recall, I got to count 1 and I got to count 2. So my salaries are in 2, so I'm going to hit 2. I'm going to put another comma, and I'm going to put the qualifier here of false because I want the exact match. So I'm going to click OK. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control C, and I'm going to move to the right, holding down the Shift button and then moving with my arrow key to the right. I'm going to do our same paste special, so Alt ES. In this case, I want formulas, so Alt ESF, and I'm going to click OK, and I get a bunch of errors. Why did I get a bunch of errors? Well, let's take a look here. So I'm going to come up to the Formulas tab, and I'm going to click on the Evaluate Formulas button just to see if our formula is working correctly. So Vlookup G8, which should be 2010, right? Because that's what I'm looking at. Evaluate 2010, yep. It's looking in there, so it's giving me back the value that I expect, $1.9 billion. So if I come over here to the row here, 2010, 1.942. Okay, matches. I'm going to get out of that by clicking escape. Let's do the same thing here, but before I do that, I'm going to click F2 just to see what reference. Oh, now you can see what's happening. Our data table, or the lookup area that we're looking for in our VLOOKUP, I forgot to lock it. So Excel doesn't know where to look. It doesn't have this lookup value here. It doesn't know where that is. It doesn't have that referenced in this lookup area or lookup table. So that's my fault. So you can see here that if you make one mistake and forget to lock a certain cell, your VLOOKUP is not going to work. So let me redo that and just lock my lookup area. So I've locked B9 through C14. I'm going to click enter. Now I can copy this, move over to the right using my shift control arrow key, and then do Alt ES F for formulas. Click OK. And now you can see that my lookup is working correctly. If I come to 2013, 1.932 billion, 1.932 billion. So that's working correctly. But you can see that there could be the potential for error if I didn't lock the cell correctly. So that's where the get pivot formula comes in, or the get pivot function comes in. It sort of alleviates the risk of that happening. So let's do this a different way, but this time we're going to use the get pivot function. So I'm going to use Control C just to bring this metric down. I'm going to paste it again, just so we can have a comparison here. And all I'm going to do is enter an equal sign on my keyboard, and then I'm going to come over to my pivot table and select the first cell in the pivot table. Okay, you notice what happened there? If I do that again, if I just move from right to left, all of a sudden I get this get pivot piece here inside my formula. So you'll see, there we go, right there, get pivot. It's got my metric of salary, which it's got a cell reference of B8, and it's got a season start of 2010. Okay, great. So you can see that my pivot table already has my built-in salary reference, and right now, because I just moved to the first cell here, which was C9, it's referencing the 2010 season start. But what I could do here is change the attribute of season start inside of this get pivot formula or get pivot function in order to do the same thing that a lookup function would do, but without the risk. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this part just to the right of the attribute that I'm changing, right? So I'm going to keep this in quotations, the season start attribute. I'm not going to touch that. I'm going to keep that, which is basically the field name, or the field 1 in this case. I'm not going to change that. I'm just going to come down to my data table here and select the row header that I want. So I'm just going to click on that cell right there, which in this case is G8, and I'm going to lock the row of 8. So I'm going to lock that row of 8 right there. See that? So that's my row. I'm going to lock that. I'm going to click escape, and I'm going to come back and do that exact same thing. I'm going to move over to my pivot table, just go from right to left, select that, highlight my 2010, select the 2010 on my data table, and lock the row by hitting F4 twice, and then I'm going to put an absolute value or an absolute reference, the $ here in front of the 8, which now is going to lock my row. Okay, I got the same number. Let's do a little bit of formatting here on this entire row before we copy this over. Reduce the decimal places, and you can see that matches, right? So all I need to do now is hit Control C, move over to the right using my Shift and then arrow keys, and I'm going to do Alt ES. I'm going to do Alt ESF or Alt ES formulas for the pay special, and look what happens. Wonderful. Everything worked out perfectly. Everything matches. All I needed to do was change one cell reference in order to reference the row header. Much easier and quicker and less risk than a lookup formula. So just to recap, what I did was I changed my season start metric where that was referencing to my data table header. So 2010 in this case. If I move over to the left, it's going to be 2011, 2012, 13, 14, and then finally 15. So say I had 2016 data in here, which I don't, but let's just pretend that we did for a minute. And all I needed to do, if that was the case, was come over here and create a 2016 header here and change this to 2016. And again, if I had that, my data would come in perfectly fine, and I could just copy this formula and bring it across. Now I could do that with a pivot table. Now I could do that with a Vlookup. But remember, I'm changing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things I have to remember. Where in the get pivot function, all I need to remember is 2 things. One is the changing of the attribute or metric for the reference here, and then remembering how to lock those cells. So 2 versus 5. So it's a little less risky to get the same output as you would for a lookup formula. Okay, let me do another exercise for you, but in this case I want to do this by a specific team. So I'm going to keep data table pretty much the same, except instead of salaries here, I already know that my header is salaries, so I'm going to come up to my pivot table and I'm going to input the team name right underneath season start and just let that go. So okay, so now I have my year and my team name. For this, I don't really need to change the view on this to a tabular view, just because I'm going to use it for a different purpose. I'm not really using this for a visualization or to actually show somebody data. I'm rather just using this to summarize data using the get pivot formula. So the way that I can do this is to make sure that I have my 29 teams from the data set through on this data side on the rows here. So what I'm going to do is just come over here. I'm going to copy these team names, Control C to copy, and then come over here and cell F14 and Control V for paste. So now I have my team names. Okay, so how can I use the get pivot formula here? You'll notice that also, just as a side here, my Vlookup broke because I added something to the pivot table, whereas my salaries metric, this is still available here by season start, even though I changed my pivot table. So there's another plus for the get pivot formula as far as risk is concerned. Okay, so what can I do? Well, I can do the exact same thing I did before, but I can now get to the granular team level. So I'm going to do the equal sign. I'm going to come over here to my pivot table and just go from right to left and get inside of the pivot table. And you notice here I've got a couple things. I've got attribute 1 is my salary. That's still selected of B8, so I still want to keep that. I've got my team attribute now, which is selected to Atlanta Hawks. I've got my season start, which is still 2010. Okay, so what do I want to do? Well, if you recall, I've got one metric here and another metric on top on my rows, and another metric up here on my columns. So I need to change 2 references inside of this get pivot. The first is to change the team name to the items that are on my row. So I'm going to highlight that section of field 1 inside of the get pivot formula and come down here to Atlanta Hawks and click that. And then I'm going to lock the column by hitting the F4 key 3 times. So now my column of F is locked. Okay, so now my team name is locked inside of the get pivot function. I'm going to do the exact same thing for the season start and select my headers here and click on 2010, except this time I'm going to lock the row reference by hitting F4 twice instead of 3 times. Then I'm going to hit the enter key. Okay, great. So if I come over here, I can see that for the 2010 season, I have 71,469,000. 71,469,000. They match. Okay, great. So I'm going to copy this using Control C. I'm going to come across and do Control V to paste it across. Perfect. Okay, I just want to do a double check here. 2015, what was my Atlanta Hawks salary? So I'm going to come down here and just go here, 71,378. Let's just go back over here and check it, 71,378. It matches. I can copy this entire row, Control C, and I'm going to come down using Shift down arrow key, and I'm going to do Alt ES formulas to paste. Change the formatting here, and now guess what? I've got the team salaries by season start year, all in this data table that is a summarization of this pivot table. Now, I could have done this with a VLOOKUP, but it would have been very difficult to do that. I would have had to have come here and done one section at a time for each VLOOKUP. Whereas with the getPivot function, I've got a summarized data table that won't change if I add something to the pivot table. So let's just show you how that's done. So if I come over here and I want to select the player rank and I just drag that down to my rows section here, watch. Nothing changed. My data table is still intact. My values are good to go. Nothing changed here. So I can come here and look, and here on the Boston Celtics for 2010, their salary was $82 million. If I come over here at Boston Celtics, $82 million. It matches perfectly. So I've reduced the risk of anything related to the lookup function or the VLOOKUP or the HLOOKUP function. I've removed that risk, and I've only changed 3 different items in this case. But I now have a fully functioning data table. So that's the power of the getPivot formula. It's very easy to use once you learn how to do it, but it's also very robust. We'll be using this quite a bit as we move forward in the course.